when it comes to news media, social media, electoral systems, and often special interest groups and nonprofits, the incentives are often to portray people in the worst light in order to get clicks, likes, follows, ad dollars, votes. That tends to give this sense of an us versus them, totally different, totally divided narrative, which is overblown. 2 to 4% of Americans say, okay, that's okay to throw a rock at a fellow American who might disagree with you. Then you ask, okay, what share of people in the other party think it's okay? Get answers that are between 40 and 50%. So this huge distortion thinking that fellow Americans are much more threatening than they really are.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Courageous Conversations about our schools. This is your host, Ken Futernick, and today we will be talking with James Cohen, the founder of an organization called More Like Us. James will be sharing some fascinating information related to perception gaps and why he thinks students in high schools should be learning about them. Welcome to the podcast, James.
Ken, thanks for having us.
James, just say a bit about yourself, where you live and what you do.
Sure. I'm James Cohen, co-founder and executive director of More Like Us. More Like Us improves the political environment in the U.S. With a focus on education, and we do a lot to correct misperceptions of each other across the political spectrum. And I live in D.C.
Terrific. And I'm going to ask you more to say a bit more about these perceptions gaps and why you think students need to learn about them in a moment. But before I have you do that, I'm going to introduce two other guests. Both are students who recently participated in a youth summit where they learn about these perception gaps that, James, you talked about. First, I want to welcome Landon Plouffe. Welcome, Landon.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Great. Really great that you're with us. Landon, where do you live and where do you go to school?
I live in Fayette, Missouri. It's a pretty small town. We only have one high school, so I go to Fayette High School, and I'll be a incoming junior.
And what subjects in school are you most interested in?
Honestly, I'd say English and history are probably my top two.
Well, thanks for being here. And Deacon Gardner, I want to introduce you. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having us. I am a rising junior at Western Albemarle High School. I live in Crozet, Virginia. And I'd say my favorite subject in school is probably social studies overall. So like history, economics, and all of those.
Great. And are you also involved in athletics?
Yes, I am a distance runner. So I do cross country, indoor track, and outdoor track. And I also run all summer.
Deacon, thanks so much for being a part of this, what I'm sure will be an interesting conversation. So let me come back to you, James. I'm hoping you can talk about what the perception gaps are and what you think students need to learn about them.
Perception gaps, it's a simple way to think about them is that we're more similar across the political spectrum than we tend to realize. It's also kind of a broader concept that people across politics tend to have distortions of each other, and these distortions are all biased in a negative direction. So thinking about those who might vote differently or identify in the other political party as more ideologically extreme, more hostile when having a conversation, more threatening in various ways, more stereotypical, just inferior, a whole host of just negative thoughts and feelings about fellow Americans that are not borne out. They're overblown. And I think it's very important for students to learn about this. Civil discourse is very important in the classroom, but there can be a lot of hesitancy to engage if one has these overly negative, stereotypical views of one another. And it's just important to understand political parties, who are our fellow Americans. This is not a world actually of just, two poles, totally opposite, no overlaps. That's actually not the world that we live in, even if it sometimes feels that way when we listen to the news or look at social media.
And this isn't just a supposition on your part. This is based on data from studies that have been done. Can you provide a couple of examples of some common perception gaps?
Yeah, sure. So, More in Common, another organization in this space, coined the term perception gaps. And in its original research, it asked Republicans and Democrats questions about ideological topics. So there was one asked about thinking of Republicans. What share of Republicans believe that properly controlled immigration can be good for America? Actually, 85% of Republicans agreed with that statement. But when you ask Democrats, what share of Republicans do you think believe this? It was barely 50%. So this like 30-point gap, this perception gap. And then there's all these other topics. There's a group called the Polarization Research Lab. They cover pretty wild topics, some of which deal with political violence. So there's a question asked very specifically about throwing a rock at a peaceful protester who has a different point of view. Do you think this is okay? 2 to 4% of Americans say, okay, that's okay to throw a rock at a fellow American who might disagree with you. Then you ask, okay, what share of people in the other party think it's okay? Get answers that are between 40 and 50%. So it's huge distortion thinking that fellow Americans are much more threatening than they really are.
Have these perception gaps in your understanding of how these things develop, have they always existed? Are they more prevalent today? And what's fueling them? What causes people to have them?
Yeah, so I have to be honest that right, the term perception gap or perception gaps was coined in 2019.
Hmm.
So we don't have a really long time series. There is a general sense that there can be some distortions of outgroups in social psychology, but these seem to be exacerbated. And in this lesson plan that we have, we talk about perverse incentives. So when it comes to news media, social media, electoral systems, and often special interest groups and nonprofits, the incentives are often to portray people in the worst light in order to get clicks, likes, follows, ad dollars, votes. And so, right, that tends to give this sense of an us versus them, totally different, totally divided narrative, which is overblown. It is true that there are differences, right? I do not want to make the claim that there are no differences between Republicans and Democrats. They're just right overstated in many ways, especially when looking at the broader public.
One of the things that I've been learning through interviews and reading about this, reading the literature on polarization in this country, is that there is a phenomenon that I think comes fairly naturally to human beings, which is this phenomenon of othering, is viewing people. We're sort of drawn and sometimes in a perverse way find it attractive to look at other people as being different. And the more different we can make them out in our minds, the better, which seems like kind of a weird thing. But what it allows us to do, I think, at times is to say, well, at least we're not like them. Thank goodness. Or it allows us to feel sometimes superior or better. Um, Sometimes they can othering allows us to sort of find a convenient target for our frustrations, our anxieties, if we can come up with these narratives in our mind that those people think this way or act this way or believe in these things. Uh, we're not like that. And there's a funny kind of comfort in doing that othering, which then, of course, would lead to perception gaps. But there's a sort of a built-in incentive sometimes for us to want to believe that other people, to perceive other people as being different. Does that resonate for you?
Well, yeah, so a lot of this deals with social psychology and right, and status is very important to people. Uh, but people can have self-worth for other reasons, and I think better reasons than just a sense that my group is better than their group. And right, I mean, people definitely shouldn't be demeaned and made to feel lesser, so maybe they look for some kind of scapegoat or thing like that. I should say that a core part of social psychology is that people can feel very strongly about their in-group, and have group identities, but that does not necessitate hating or demeaning or diminishing other groups,
Mm.
right? There can be other groups out there that are just, yeah, somewhat different. Maybe I'm not part of them, right? We're talking about track team, but like, right, there's whatever the baseball team. That doesn't mean the baseball team is terrible. It's just a different team that I'm not on. And that's, I think, a much better dynamic where we can see, positives in other groups and not just rely on some kind of usually specious notion that we're somehow better than they are.
Yeah. I would think social media is it played a pretty important role in promoting these differences. And Landon and Deegan, I want to bring you in for just a minute and hear your thoughts about what we're talking about. Do you get a sense in your own experiences in school that there is this sort of othering phenomenon that goes on, that people are motivated to see others, whether they're sports people involved in sports or people involved in theater or people involved in who knows what. In my day, there were these sort of nerdy people that were really interested in being in school, and they were kind of othered by others that said, "Oh, you're not very cool because of that." Do you, Landon? Do you see some of that going on in your own experience in school?
Yeah, absolutely. And that like more nerdy, I guess, that more nerdy versus like 40 archetype type thing,
Yeah,
that's definitely something that still goes on today. Um, I would say that there's also a second part of just rivalry, like towns, school versus school. That's something that happens a lot here, between sports teams. And of course, there's nothing super wrong with, having a healthy rivalry or competition
mm,
between two different sports teams. But at some points, there's been times in our school's past where things have gotten almost violent between two different schools, just because we think, that they're below us or they think that they're above us or something like that. That it just like it makes us feel like the other people are like lesser
yeah.
of a human being than we are. And it just leads to a lot of problems that aren't really needed at all, especially in something as small as a sports game, like a basketball game or a football game.
Yeah, I guess under ideal conditions, you'd like to think that when teams, from different towns, counties, cities come together and play, that yes, there's a really great competition. People are trying to win, but that the participants, the parents in particular, and even the coaches and the other people that come and cheer your team on would realize this is just a game. It's a chance to get together. And when it's all over, we're going to be good sports and embrace one another and say what a cool thing it was that we get to come together. And this is just for the sake of sport. It's not that we view each other as human beings as being different. It's just uh, but it doesn't always go that way. And it sounds like you've had some experiences where it spills over into how we perceive each other as humans, not just as the Wildcats versus the Cougars or something. Deacon, what are your thoughts as you listen to this conversation?
So, kind of made me think of something similar, not exactly with sports, but at the academic level at my school. My school has a peer tutoring program that I work with. So, I work with a lot of different kinds of kids who about different kinds of things. And what I've seen through that is there's a really like there's a perception of like a separation between the kids who are really smart academically versus the kids who aren't and they're better at other things. So a lot of the way people perform in school, from what I've seen, is based on, their performance in one section of academics.
Yeah, so I'm going to come back and ask both of you about the uh, opportunity you had to learn about these perception gaps. But I want to come back to you, James, and have you talk a little bit about the lesson plans you've developed and what impact you think they're having on kids that get to experience these lessons.
Yeah. So we've developed it and more like us a perception gap lesson plan. So lasts for one block period or two regular class periods. We cover various examples of these kinds of perception gaps, some of the causes, consequences and potential solutions. It starts with an activity, some sticky notes on a board, and a video that performed very well in an academic competition that Stanford ran. I think these are valuable for all sorts of reasons. There's media literacy overlaps when it comes to the causes. Um, there are just benefits in terms of understanding the political parties. There are personal benefits to right, navigating cliques and stereotypes among fellow students. There's a lot of data, that underlies this. And so when teachers are trying to teach about um, survey data and polling, this is a great opportunity to cover that. So there's a lot of different directions that teachers can use this. In the beginning of the year, helping civil discourse to reduce anxiety. And so, we think it can be used in lots of different ways in a classroom, and it has been.
I wonder if you followed up with teachers who have used these lesson plans to find out if it actually has the what I think would be the desired effect, which is to reduce perception gaps. But talk a little bit about what you've noticed with teachers who have been using these lesson plans.
Yeah, so I think it benefits the students. We've done some survey work with students who've enjoyed the lesson, feel like they've learned a lot, found the information quite surprising and memorable. And now we're working with the Civic Education Research Lab at Georgetown University to really test the impacts on this. That yes, it can reduce these misperceptions, but how does this change how we think and feel about fellow Americans across the political spectrum? How does it change attitudes toward democratic norms or even political violence? There's all these like other questions in these surveys. We have a pre and post survey that are part of the lesson plan, and hope that teachers feel comfortable using them, and we at More Like Us can work with teachers to actually successfully deploy them in the classroom.
A little later, James, I'm going to ask you where people can get access to these lesson plans, and we'll be posting links to it on our episode webpage for this too. But so listeners out there, hang tight. James will tell where you can, if you're interested in looking into these lesson plans, where you can get them. But you don't have to rely on uh, completely on studies being done at Georgetown. We have two students with us today who've had an experience learning about these perception gaps. And I want to come to both of you and say, what were some really important things you learned about perception gaps that you thought were really valuable? And what did you take away from that experience? How was it affecting your life? I'll start with you, Landon.
Yeah, like James said earlier, one of the big topics that were discussed between different voting types, Republicans and Democrats, was the immigration issue. I think that was one that really stood out to me. Part of the lesson was this video where it had these different like confessional type videos from different types of voters and what they thought other party voters thought of them and what they would think about certain issues. And it was just so far off from reality. And I mean, like, I can definitely see where that, like, sort of misconception can happen. Um, as a teenager, like, obviously, I am very involved in social media. Uh, I scroll TikTok endlessly throughout the day, especially during the summer. And there's just like so much misinformation that can happen um, without really going fact checked. Um, you'll see misquotes, things being pulled out of context, different clips being taken of people, and there's just like no real way in the moment to know whether or not something's true, that you'll just like develop these like snap opinions of something without really thinking twice about it. And then all of that will just make you think of any like Republican voter you think of as some sort of like maniac who wants everybody kicked out of the country, or some Democrat that just wants every woman to get an abortion or something like that. Like it's just so easy to make those misconceptions just because there's so much misinformation and just people want to like have this like sense of community like banding together against something else to make them feel better about
Mhm.
themselves and like feel that sense of belonging.
So is your one of your takeaways from learning about the perception gap to make you a little more skeptical of what you see on social media and to say, I'm not going to go with that necessarily. There's a good chance that people are motivated to want to say things that aren't necessarily true. But what impact has it had on you personally, learning about these perception gaps?
I live in a rural conservative town, so like obviously I'll have opinions that are different from other people's. And I think that the perception gap lesson really just kind of taught me that I need to take what other people say more seriously. Like, I can't just go into something thinking that I'm always going to be right. I need to listen to what other people think. I need to listen to what their views are, what their core interests are, and maybe I'll find something that we have a little bit more common ground on than I thought we've really had before.
Boy, I think America would be so much better off if more people did what you just described. So it's a really, if that's happening with you and Deacon, maybe with you and many others that are learning about this, that's likely to bring us closer to, feeling a bit of unity and more like we rather than us and them, which I think this country needs a lot of nowadays. Deacon, how about you? What were some takeaways for you from this experience learning about perception gaps?
So after the presentation, we talked about it for a while. I was surprised I didn't know a lot of these things, but I've also since then I've been looking deeper into it, and I was actually able to talk to people about it. I was at another similar program. I just got back last week. It was about freedom and democracy and such, the First Amendment, and we did a lot of discussions, and I would find ways I realize that we had two different sides talking, but neither side would actually really be telling like a full story. They would just be telling their part of the story. So I was able to integrate that to kind of really bring everyone together, I think, more together.
Yeah. One of the things I've learned in this podcast, talking with people like Amanda Ripley and Peter Coleman, Monica Guzman, who have written extensively about why we're so polarized, why we have these perception gaps, is that becoming a really good listener, where we're listening without judging and going into it with preconceived ideas. And I think, Landon, you were alluding to that. And simply sometimes looping back and saying, I've heard you talk about your perspectives on this topic. Maybe it's immigration or it's gun control or reproductive rights. Let me see if I understand you well, rather than let me tell you why I disagree with you. And oftentimes when we do that and loop back and simply say, did I get that right? People say, not exactly, let me clarify, or you miss one important part. But people also really appreciate being heard. And we all like that. But oftentimes I think it would lessen the perception gap for us to become better listeners. Uh, and to make sure that we really understand rather than just going to our preconceived notions. And both you, Deegan and Landon, were talking about that a little bit. So, what better place for this to happen, these kind of conversations, this kind of learning, than schools? But I want to throw out an idea, because I learned this. I heard this idea from someone that I want to talk about for a second and see what all of you think about this. I interviewed a guy named Daryl Davis, a few months ago. Daryl Davis is he's a very accomplished musician. He's a black man. He's played with Jerry Lee Lewis and Chuck Berry in the past. Um, but he also had a chance to play music in clubs on the East Coast where there were um, people that came up to him, white people, and got to talking to him. And some of them said, I've never spoken to black people before. And one of them, it turns out, was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. And Daryl Davis thought he couldn't believe it was true. You're talking to me. We're talking about music. You're a nice person. And Daryl eventually says, "How could you be involved in an organization that hates people like me without even knowing who I am?" But when I continued to interview Daryl, he said his willingness to do that really goes back to when he was a child. He was the child of two parents who were part of the State Department. They were working in Europe, and the schools that Daryl went to were populated by people from all over the world, from Africa and several nations in Europe and Asia. People looked different. They had different religious backgrounds, different perspectives. And he said, because that was my experience growing up with all these different kids, I never even knew what racism was. It didn't exist because we were all learning and interacting and playing sports and all kinds of things together. And it wasn't until he was about 12 years old and back in America, he was a Boy Scout. And in a parade, he was one of the only black people, maybe the only black person in the parade. And people started throwing cans and bottles at him. He didn't know why. And later, his parents introduced the concept of racism. And he was shocked. He said, how could people hate me just because of my color of my skin? So he later would ask that of Klanspeople, and over 200 Klansmen that Daryl then decided to interact with turned over their robes and hoods to him, saying, I'm going to disavow this hate ideology because having met you and learned what a great person you are and someone I consider a friend doesn't jive with this hateful organization. So what Daryl says about what he thinks should be going on in schools is that there should be fewer clubs just for black kids, fewer clubs just for Latino kids, or fewer clubs, LGBTQ clubs, where people who share something in common are meeting separately from everyone else. Because I get why people want to do that, if there's some safety and comfort in that. But he said, what I really think needs to happen and what educators would be well advised to do is to help kids form clubs around common interest. So you essentially create the kind of environment he had when he was going to school, where you're interacting with and doing things that you care about, whether it's sports or photography or drama or who knows what. But you're doing it together with people who are different. And he believes, I think he would say if he were with us today on this conversation, that is also, in addition to the lessons that you're talking about, James, and both of you experienced, that's a really critically important way to reduce or eliminate perception gaps. And I'm wondering if this makes sense to you, if you think that there's some wisdom in what Daryl Davis has to say about that. Deegan, how about you?
I was actually thinking about that, something very similar just this morning. I honestly, so I think it would, that's the best way to go about it. However, I don't think you can just switch to that because people are already inclined to just be with their own people.
Mm-hmm.
So if you just pull them apart from their own people, they're going to fight back. And that just makes the problem worse because then it becomes like these people are like hurting us. But having having all these different groups come together without necessarily even having like a particular purpose to be there, just being together. Not based on who they are or what they look like, but based on, what they do, what they like to do, and such. That lets them actually get to know each other as people and not as what they are.
Do you think that would be helpful in the school that you attend?
Yes, I absolutely think so.
Yeah. Landon, what do you think about this? Do you think this is also part of a solution in addition to learning in class, say about perception gaps and all the things that you got to do and the things that James is talking about, is more interaction across these lines that sometimes keep us apart?
Yeah, I do think that it would help. It's just the fact that, where I live, it's not a very diverse place to begin with. So there's not really these different social groups that can be like pushed together in the first place. So I think it needs to be more of like that point, helping rural communities develop out and connect with each other in sort of like a web network of different schools that you can get even more people together just because there's like so few different groups of people, I guess I would say, in some of these more rural communities. Like, I absolutely do agree with the idea of, uh, breaking apart these like identity groups rather than just like bonding over an activity or shared interests. It's just like, how would we get more rural and less diverse communities involved with this too?
So, Landon, I want to share with you a recommendation made by someone I interviewed about 2 weeks ago. His name is Jonathan Zimmerman. He's a history of education professor at the University of Pennsylvania. He's now honored to have him on my advisory board so he can make more suggestions to me about what we ought to be doing with this podcast. But what he said was, and it's directly in alignment with what you just talked about. He said, we can do this. We can, schools can say, on every Wednesday at noon, our social studies classes are going to connect with people in some other state around an issue like reproductive rights or gun control or immigration, and have a Zoom call like this where people pair up and say, here's the question. What do you think about our country should do with respect to immigration or reproductive rights? And, have it facilitated where people can listen to each other. Does that sound like something that would be attractive to you to participate in, where you would get a chance, once a week or once every couple of weeks to interact with people from not in Missouri, but maybe in Virginia, maybe in California, maybe in Mississippi?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the reasons that I went to the program at George Mason in the first place, was just to be able to connect with people who might have different ideas or point of views than myself. So having that be more accessible to like the general school public would definitely help a lot of people, I think, with that perception gap issue. And not even just that, but just like getting to know other people more and getting to know different perspectives.
So, Landon, I want to just pose a challenge to you and you as well, Deegan, is that if you like this idea, I hope you'll share it with some of the educators at your school and say, could we find a way to interact with people in other parts of the country and to have good civil conversations about important topics so that we can begin to reduce these perception gaps and get to know what other people think? I do want to mention, just it occurred to me, there's an organization called All Sides. They do this kind of thing. And so if educators that you spoke to said, yeah, we're interested, but we don't have the capability of sort of putting that together, but you might mention a group called All Sides. They do exactly what we're talking about. But James, I want to bring you back in and have you comment on what you've been listening to.
Yeah, so for all sides, it's called mismatch. this program to bring classrooms from across the country together. There's also something called the American Exchange Project, where students actually travel to other parts of the country. I'd say regarding Daryl Davis, I will respond with a performer's kind of idea. So in improv, there's something called yes and, right? And so, how do people formulate thoughts and feelings about other groups, right? There is both interpersonal interaction and what people see and hear about each other. So, there's no reason that it should be 100%, just talking to each other, right? It also matters the environment that we're in, scrolling on TikTok, etc. And then in terms of groups in a school, I don't think I am one to say, oh, there should not be certain groups. I don't exactly know the argument that he's making. I think as long as there's, a variety of groups and people are not only in extremely specific identity groups, to me, there's not a huge problem if someone's in, some kind of LGBTQ group and a sport, right? Like there'll be different groups that people are in, and right, I don't see necessarily a need to choose one or the other. There could be certain cases when it's gone like so far into narrow identity categories, but one important thing about identity is that it's so multifaceted. If we start listing all of our identities, we will actually get dozens and dozens of aspects about ourselves, even if sometimes we only hear about, like race, gender, or sexuality, like just a few. There's actually, many more that make up each individual.
Yeah, I like what you're saying, James. I think there's an affinity we have. There's something about having something in common, or ethnicity, or race, or maybe we have some common belief about something and we meet and talk about it. But I think what you're saying is that it shouldn't be exclusively that way, that there ought to be, educators ought to be encouraging people to say, okay, that's one uh, area of commonality, of affinity. But we also want to encourage people to come together who are interested in uh, as I mentioned, photography or some hobby or whatever it may be, who'd like to come. And then you pull from all those groups and say, oh, not only am I a member of this group, but I'm a member of this group focused around an interest, a common interest. And there I'm dealing with people uh, that are that aren't in that other group. And so I'm interacting with them as well. James, just as we draw this really fascinating conversation to a close, anything you want to add about the perception gap work you've been doing and these lesson plans? And I do want you to say, by the way, where people can learn more about More Like Us and these lesson plans that you've developed.
Yes. So when it comes to the perception gap lesson plan, it's on our website, morelikeus.org, under the category resources. And we have a couple other resources that might interest you if you're there. In the lesson plan, it includes the links to both the pre-survey done, before going through the lesson and the post-survey done immediately after. Uh, Admittedly, this can be easier to implement in a private or parochial school. There's just less red tape. But Georgetown University has gone through its institutional review board and it is completely exempt. No parents actually need to sign off from Georgetown's standpoint about it. So hopefully, there aren't too many hurdles to go over. If there are any challenges, always welcome to reach out. My contact information is on the website. And we're really trying to do this in the fall. Georgetown and More Like Us will be presenting at a national conference in December with hopefully a very robust set of results.
Well, great. Well, thanks for sharing that and doing this great work. I want to thank each of you for being part of this episode of Courageous Conversations about our schools. Fascinating topic, really important topic. And I wish all of you well. You're about to start school in the next couple of weeks, I guess. So I wish you well this year as juniors. And James, thanks for telling us about this great work you've been doing. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us, Ken.
So, listeners, you can find this and all of our episodes of Courageous Conversations about our schools at schoolconversations.org. We will include the links that James mentioned about today's conversation on the webpage for this episode. You can also listen to all of our episodes wherever you listen to your podcasts. Bye, everyone.